Over the last couple of days, I've been doing what I do around the studio here. That's getting deals, doing videos, cutting new builds, whether it be potatoes or brand new computers. And then this news story pops up. And it was set loose via Steve over at Hardware Unboxed. And then after that, followed up by the tech Jesus himself, Steve from Gamers Nexus. And they made some really good points. Hardware Unboxed even took it a step further and put the benchmarks that they posted on the Principal Technologies commissioned benchmarks against their own benchmarks and found these numbers to be seriously misleading. And this is why I'm making the video here today, because these benchmarks only aren't just misleading, they differ from what we would expect out of companies from the, the pre-release benchmarks, the numbers that they're used to posting up. Now, when NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel usually have these pre-release benchmarks, they kind of show their CPUs in the best possible light. In other words, they cherry pick some benchmarks where their products will be running better than the competitors. But the biggest problem this time around is that the competitor's product, and that's AMD and mainly the 2700X, because this is going to be the main competitor to the 9900K, this CPU has been seriously hemorrhaged and debilitated in these benchmarks, and it is disgusting when you look at it, really. And apparently Intel commissioned these benchmarks to a company called Principal Technologies, and in this case I think Intel ought to decommission these benchmarks straight away, and that's because they're misleading, and the average person that goes up and looks up some 9900K benchmarks on Google might go then and see these benchmarks and be like, oh, I better get one of these because I'm going to get 50% extra performance in games, when we know that as reviewers this is completely false. Most people with a 1080 Ti and even the RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti's are going to be playing at higher resolutions, whether it be 144 Hz, 1440p or 4K, and you're going to see sometimes as little as like a 2 or 3% difference. And they cut the 8-core 16-threaded $300 CPU in half, and I feel like the 2700X is currently AMD's, not only it's their best value proposition, but it's their best gaming CPU too. And I'm looking through these benchmarks, there's a total of 19 of them conducted. They were then posted by a website called PC Gamers N, where they then put them in graph form. And you can see in some of these benchmarks, there was a big difference between the 2700X and the 9900K. And also, if you look closely, you'll see that the 9900K is also sometimes beating out the 8700K and the 8086K, which shouldn't be happening. And so we go back to this original paper, we start doing some more in-depth reading, and we see that the settings are just all over the place. For starters, on the 9900K, they're using the Z390, and they haven't really disabled anything. Then you move over to the 8700K, they've disabled multi-core enhancement, so they're making sure these run at lower clocks than the 9900K. This is within Intel's own CPU lineup. And then we move over down to the 2700X, and again, everything's been disabled. And then we move over to the memory timings, which is so important for AMD CPUs, especially when it comes to benchmarking video games. AMD's Ryzen CPUs love a combination of higher memory speeds as well as lower latencies. And so I was a bit surprised to see here that they just locked in a lazy manual 2933 megahertz without changing the timings at all. And then they went to Intel's side and they enabled the XMP profiles, essentially dropping the latency down on the memory and then capping that to 2666 megahertz, as if to say, hey, we gave AMD an advantage here, guys, when in fact they actually gave Intel another advantage on memory speeds too, because Intel, if you guys didn't know, it actually likes lower latencies for gaming more so than higher speeds on the memory. AMD, on the other hand, especially with Ryzen, it likes, as we just said before, a combination of higher speeds and lower latencies. You couple them together, you're going to get better FPS to a certain point. And moving through these benchmarks, at least the ones that show the biggest discrepancies, at least from what I know in testing some of these games and what we're seeing here, Ashes of the Singularity. This game uses up to pretty much a maximum of 16 threads. And isn't it ironic that the 9900K has 16 threads? Past that, you'll see the core utilization really drop off in this game, and it's not that good of an optimized game. It's actually got inherent input lag in the game itself, and I've tested this in the past, and hence why I've dropped it from my benchmark suite of games. But here's where we saw the biggest difference between the Ryzen 5 1400 and the 9900K. Moving through some more of these benchmarks, we could see big discrepancies in Fortnite, PUBG, Far Cry 5, Civ 6, Rainbow Six Siege, and Rise of the Tomb Raider. And now the biggest telltale sign is that these benchmarks should not be taken seriously is when we look at the 2700X numbers, also compared to the 2950X and the 2990WX. I've tested all these three CPUs in the past, and the 2700X does the best for gaming out of AMD's CPUs. So I was really surprised to see it losing to even its big brother counterparts, which have more cores and threads and are more suited to streaming and also productivity. But then we also take things back on these benchmarks and we look at, for instance, Rainbow Six Siege versus PUBG with their own numbers with the 8086K versus the 8700K. And we can see that there's just inconsistencies within their own benchmarks themselves, which just makes me really scratch my head as a reviewer who actually does proper benchmarking and tests things apples to apples, because I don't believe these CPUs were even tested apples to apples. But wait, the ridiculousness, the ridiculousness. Is it? Yeah. But wait, the ridiculousness doesn't stop there. If we look at the way they've tested these games, they've used the in-game benchmarks whenever they could, but then they've also used fraps and just reported average FPS numbers. There's no 0.1 and 1% lows, which are arguably way more important in a CPU test for gaming than they are for a graphics card. I'm actually fine with people using average and minimum FPS for GPU benchmarks. But when it comes to CPU benchmarks at high frame rates, we want to know if the CPU is stuttering, so other variables with that CPU and combination of testing can be identified as maybe flawed or whatnot. And so all we're seeing is average numbers across fraps and in-game benchmarks. And as Steve from Gamers Nexus pointed out too, they're only using a median benchmark. In other words, they're only just picking one benchmark out of the who knows how many runs they did. They could have just run these benchmarks once for all we know. They're just that inconsistent. But now here's where things get more frustrating for me as a reviewer. I'm under NDA, so I can't refute these claims until the 19th of October this month. But I want to send an open message to Intel, and that is, please decommission these benchmarks because they're just not accurate. They're not even cherry-picked benchmarks, which is kind of, as I said in the intro, expected of major companies like yourself, Nvidia, and AMD. Everyone knows you do it, but when you're hemorrhaging the competitors' products, it's just not fair and it's misleading to consumers. So then the average guy could search up numbers for the 9900K, come across these benchmarks in these fancy graphs, and think, wow, I'm performing 50% better in games. But then when you go to the bottom of the page, there's a freaking disclaimer to say, hey, we don't take any accountability for these inconsistent benchmarks. So at the end of the day, as someone who takes pride in my benchmarking and the way I present numbers to you guys, I just find this so misleading. And I mean, we're all guilty of making mistakes. When I make a mistake, I'll tell you guys. If it's a big enough mistake that I feel it could mislead people, I'll take my video down. Anyway guys, that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button, but also let us know in the comment section below what you think about this whole 9900K commission benchmarks. I just think it's not right. I mean, Intel don't have to do this. I mean, I'm sure the 9900K is going to be a solid product. They're bringing back soldering too between the IHS and the die. So it feels like they're listening to the consumers and reviewers like myself who have critiqued them in the past for these things. But then they go and commission these things and put out a statement saying that this data is consistent with what they're getting in their own labs. I really don't know what was going on with that reply either. I mean, seriously, just decommission these benchmarks. We'll get you guys out some solid numbers day one that you can actually rely on and make a solid purchasing decision when it comes to the 9900K. But anyway, when it comes to opinions, I'm sure everyone has one, and I implore you guys to reserve yours until the product is released and we can see real numbers from trusted sources. Anyway, I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye. Trusted sources like this new merch right here. Ooh, yeah. You gotta get some Tech Yes City retro shirts, baby. Link in description below.